Hello and welcome for Midweek Bible Study. We are picking up where we left off last week, Acts chapter 14, beginning in verse 21. We will go to the end of this chapter at the end of verse 28 and pause there. I want to remind you that we have been looking at this map of Paul's first missionary journey, and this is roughly between the years of 46 to 48 AD. So we're not talking about too many years past the crucifixion of Jesus Christ that the gospel was being spread throughout the areas of the Mediterranean Sea. In the verses we've been studying, it's Acts 13:4 all the way through the verse that we're concluding with today in our study. Remember that they began at a city known as Antioch in Syria, and they sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to the island nation of Cyprus. They began on the eastern seaboard and made their way westward to the city of Paphos, where they again crossed another portion of the Mediterranean, and they came to a city known as Perga of Pamphylia. They moved inland to a mainland area known as Pisidian Antioch. So you've got an Antioch here and an Antioch here. This one's Syrian. This one is Pisidian because of the area of Pamphylia and Pisidia. They then moved on to a city known as Iconium, then south to Lystra, eastward to Derbe, and that's where we ended last week. And we're going to see that they begin to make a backwards trek, if you will, to the cities. And notice these arrows point back to Lystra, back to Iconium, back to Pisidian Antioch, back down to a place called Attalia, which is just west of Perga of Pamphylia. And then they're going to make their way back, skipping the island nation of Cyprus, all the way back to Syrian Antioch, where they will spend a considerable amount of time at the end of this first missionary journey. So let's go to Acts 14, beginning in verse 21. And when they had preached the gospel to that city, talking about Derbe, and made many disciples, they returned. And there's that key emphasis. They're backtracking to these cities, to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Now, of course, that's talking about Pisidian Antioch. Strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. Now, I want to focus on that word there, exhorting. That's a word that we talked about on Sunday morning in our sermon that means to encourage, to admonish, to gently instruct and correct. And it's born out of a sense of love. We connected that on Sunday morning with the one another phrases, to love one another, encourage one another, exhort one another, admonish one another, and not to devour one another. So here we see an early model of what church growth ought to be. It's teaching and preaching, and it's exhorting. And all good preaching ought to be a combination of instruction and encouragement. And so when we get that combination, we can have church growth. We see it here in Paul's first missionary journey. He's exhorting them to continue in the faith. We need encouragement. We need to assemble, and we need to be reminded and admonished of our obligations to God. So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Now, several things here that we can pull out of verse 23. First of all, we see an example of praying and fasting. We don't find fasting commanded in the New Testament, but we do see it by example. And fasting is the practice of restricting diet and food intake for a set period of time. And the intent of that is to focus one spiritually. Now, while we see that by example, it's not commanded, but sometimes it happens naturally in our lives. For example, maybe you've been so grief-stricken with the loss of a loved one that you found yourself just at a loss of appetite. And maybe for a period of several hours or maybe even the course of a couple of days, you just don't eat very much. Well, that's the body's natural coping mechanism of fasting as a result of the emotional stress of grief. So we see here that they are praying and fasting in an effort to not be focused so much on the physical aspects of life, on the flesh, but instead to be focused on the spiritual aspects. What they were doing here was a very serious matter. They were appointing elders in every church. Now, I want you to think about this trek, this map we've been going back and forth with, looking at the missionary journey of Paul. And in all of these cities where they had made converts, there was by necessity the establishment of a congregation. Now, this takes place over the course of 2 years. It would be a long journey to make that journey in the first century. It would take time to teach, to instruct, to baptize new converts, and to establish preachers and to establish elders. But it's a process that took place within the process of 2 years. And that means that they had to have taught and converted and preached the word and established some men who met qualifications to be an elder. And this is always a good place for us to look at qualifications for elders. While this isn't our study for Midweek Bible Study today, I would encourage you to write these verses down and go back and do your own personal study. You're going to find qualifications for elders in two different locations. Titus chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, you're going to see qualifications for elders. I just want to quickly touch base here so you know where to find this if you're ever studying qualifications for elders. I would encourage men to strongly consider living their lives in such a way that they meet the qualifications to be an elder. Fathers, teach your sons to live in such a way and make decisions that they will be qualified to be an elder. For this reason, I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking. Well, what was lacking? Eldership. And appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. Notice the emphasis on every city. These are not elders who serve in a regional capacity, but it's in every congregation where those cities are. If a man is, now here are the qualifications: blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. For a bishop, and that's just another word for elder, must be blameless, as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. Notice the emphasis on exhortation. Paul did that on his missionary journey, and he appointed men who met these qualifications that they would continue the work of exhortation. And that is an elder's responsibility. The remaining portion of Titus chapter 1 deals with the elder's task and what he must be able to do. But shouldn't all men want to meet those qualifications? And then the second place you're going to find it is 1 Timothy chapter 3 in the first 7 verses. This is a faithful saying: if a man desires the position of a bishop, again, there's that same word that means overseer or elder, he desires a good work. I just want to speak about that for a moment as we look at it as a qualification. Sometimes the more you become engaged in a work, the more the desire grows. Let me give you an example from my own life. I did not intend to become a gospel preacher, but it just so happened that things worked out in such a way that I was asked to begin to preach. And at first, I was very reluctant and I tried not to do it. But then the more I did it, the more I began to desire it, the more I wanted to do it. And that desire grew as I gained more experience. The same could be true of the eldership. If a man meets the qualifications, but he feels as if he doesn't desire it enough, then the answer to that might be you actually take the position of eldership and desire grows as you continue in that role. And then again, these same sort of qualifications are reiterated from Titus 1 over here in 1 Timothy 3. It's followed up in 1 Timothy, incidentally, by a paragraph about the qualifications of deacons. And it says likewise. So deacons have very similar sort of qualifications that they are talked about here, about ruling their children well, the husbands of one wife, and so on and so forth. So just a couple of places for you to go back and dig out and study qualifications for elders. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1 brings us back over to Acts chapter 14 here, this emphasis on exhorting them to continue in the faith and appointing elders to make sure that that work was done. So that's the very reason that elders were appointed in every city. And it was a very serious and solemn spiritual occasion, as it was accompanied by their praying and their fasting. All right, so on to verse 24. And after they had passed through Pisidia, which again, that's the city of Antioch, is in that region. They came to Pamphylia. Now, when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there, they sailed to Antioch. Now, this Antioch is Syrian Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. So they sail from Attalia all the way across the Mediterranean here to Syrian Antioch. And that's where they're going to end up here on this first missionary journey. Now, when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed there a long time with the disciples. And so this is going to be kind of a home base for them here in Syria at the city of Antioch. I think it's interesting there that we see that they give a report when they come back to their home congregation to let them know. And it was just typical of the case of missionaries today. If you support missionaries who maybe travel to India, typically they come back with some sort of explanation as to the good works that have been done and have been accomplished by that. So that second kind of wave of the missionary journey was to go back and revisit the cities they had already been to and established congregations. They were busy about the business of appointing elders and strengthening the converts through exhortation, that gentle and loving correction and instruction that they were giving to them. That's another pattern. We've talked a lot about patterns in Acts of how things have occurred. That's going to be the pattern of the missionary journeys. Thank you so much for joining in with Midweek Bible Study. And next week, we'll begin at the beginning of chapter 15.